All right, so as the dust settles on Kenya Kwanza's inaugural budget, the question that lingers is just how will the 3.6 trillion shilling budget be financed? On one hand, the government intends to raise 2.57 trillion shillings in taxes, and on the other, borrows 718 billion shillings. But as Jimmy Mbogo reports, the taxes may just be the weak point in the plan, with KRA struggling to meet its revenue targets.
Treasury CS Professor Njuguna Ndung'u outlined the government's plan to spend 3.68 trillion shillings starting this July. Alongside the plan was an outline of just how the National Treasury intends to fund Kenya's largest budget. Treasury intends to raise 2.96 trillion shillings in revenue, comprising of 2.57 trillion shillings in taxes, 348.7 billion shillings in ministerial appropriation in aid, and 42.2 billion shillings in grants. But the question is, just how will the CS raise this revenue? Treasury introduced a series of new taxes in a bid to raise revenue, but admits there is room to expand the tax base.
The Kenya Revenue Authority is implementing reforms to move towards seamless taxation by ensuring that its systems, taxpayers and businesses are integrated to allow for the automatic movement of data through machine-to-machine based processes, and where appropriate, shift to real-time processing. This will enable KRA to monitor business transactions in real time, therefore sealing revenue leakages through tax avoidance and evasion.
This is a situation where you see companies having two payrolls: payroll for the government and an internal payroll for management, so that you don't pay the due tax to the government. This would normally happen if companies think you are overtaxing them, and they think if they are paying the taxes, either they close down or then they make losses.
What the Treasury Ministry has tried to achieve is to look for items that have what is called a high inelasticity, precisely things like fuel, things like sugar, where you don't have almost direct substitutes.
The revenue collection challenge, however, remains a real threat to Treasury's target. Data compiled by KTN News from the Declaration of Revenue and Expenditure by the National Treasury through the Kenya Gazette illustrates the challenges ahead for the government and KRA. For instance, as at the end of March 2023, KRA had collected 1.39 trillion shillings, falling short of its revenue target of 2.1 trillion shillings by 714.97 billion shillings. As at the end of April 2023, KRA had collected 1.57 trillion shillings, falling short of its revenue target of 2.1 trillion shillings by 535 billion shillings. As at the end of May 2023, KRA had collected 1.7 trillion shillings, falling short of its revenue target of 2.1 trillion shillings by 367.9 billion shillings. On a monthly basis, KRA's revenue collection was 157.17 billion shillings. In March, 179.87 billion shillings, while in April, 167.18 billion shillings. Is there any further danger to setting the revenue collection targets high?
For some reason, the Cabinet Secretary and his colleagues believe that increasing the taxes will give us more money or will make us collect more resources for running the government. I don't think that's accurate. I think there is a miss, and if we have this conversation around the same time next year, I assure you that we will talk of lower collections.
With the revenue shortages, the government may be forced to slow down on development projects, a factor that is already evident on declaration by Treasury through the National Gazette. As at the end of May 2023, 1 month to the end of the financial year, government had only spent 191 billion shillings out of the 393.8 billion shillings, which was 48.5% of the planned spending on development. To remedy this, the government is set to prioritize public-private partnership in its development projects.
Due to the limited fiscal space, the government has strengthened the public-private partnership (PPP) framework to leverage on private sector expertise to deliver projects that have strong economic, commercial, and environmental benefits that are also aligned to our national priorities with sustainability and climate change as key considerations and drivers.
But of concern to many Kenyans is the turn towards the IMF and the World Bank, from which the CS plans to draw over $3.5 billion by 2025. The concerns arise from the conditionality of the support programs, which include restructuring of parastatals, which many fear will lead to job losses.
A large number of state corporations rely on the exchequer funding to service their payroll and other expenses. Over the years, bloated payrolls have remained a large burden to the exchequer, resulting in accumulated unserviced statutory obligations, and also pensions liability running into billions of Kenya shillings. To address this challenge, the State Corporations Advisory Committee, SCAC, will immediately embark on an aggressive program to rationalize staff establishment to keep them lean and strictly adhere to 70-30 ratio of technical staff to support staff.
That said, with the ambitious spending, what Kenyans will be keenly watching to see is whether the Ruto-led administration will keep its word, cut down on government excesses, or will it turn out to be yet another unfulfilled promise to the country? Jimmy Mbogo, KTN News, Nairobi.
And meanwhile, the ODM party